My name is Chris Bailey. Welcome to Shed Talks Recovery. I'm a man in long-term recovery, and what that means for me is that I've been able to resolve my problematic relationship with drugs and alcohol, and sustain that since August 7th of 1997. I'm developing this channel with the drive to contact individuals that are recovery curious, for those that are in recovery, or those that may have family members that are in recovery. I'm a certified recovery support specialist, and I've done a lot of program development and co-chair work at the state and national levels. Um, I'm a qualified peer supervisor and a subject matter expert, not just on addiction, but on recovery. And my hope is to develop this channel in attracting a tribe of individuals that are looking at trying to manage and develop not only their own recovery, but to help others in their recovery. And I hope that you choose to join me for further Shed Talks. This is the Shed. This is where we'll recover. But please smash the like button and subscribe. And make sure to let me know in the comments below if you're interested. I really want to thank you for taking the time to watch this video. Hey everybody, and welcome to Shed Talks Recovery. In this edition, we're going to be continuing a discussion around a book that was written by an individual named Kenneth Leong called The Zen Teachings of Jesus. Just a caveat, I'm not going to go into a whole prelude. I'm not here to espouse one particular faith pathway or faith life way for people, or one particular religion. We're utilizing this to extract some spiritual tools that we can apply to our lives. And for those of us that are in recovery or seeking recovery or have a family member that is dealing with addiction, we want to get our family into recovery to help us along that line. If y'all have missed any of those videos, there will be some cards flashing above the screen that you can click to go back to access the playlist, to do whatever you need to do in order to acquaint yourself with the subject matter at hand. In this particular episode, we're going to be talking about the third key that will open the door to allow us to exit out of hellish moments. Again, this is a Zen Buddhist approach to the teachings of Jesus. It's looking at Jesus not necessarily as a Messiah or the Lord and Savior. It's looking at Jesus as a Zen teacher. And in this particular third key that opens that door, Leong in his book tells us that it's a result of our thought. Now, this is something that can be controversial for those of us that are dealing with addiction, because we have a compulsive tendency, which I will get into in later videos when we talk about the anatomy of addiction. There is something deeply entrenched inside of the brains, not just the minds, but inside the brains of many people who deal with addiction, that results in compulsive and impulsive behavior. It's really not about thinking, it's about choice. The difficulty also points at the solution. And so what results from that compulsive behavior is obsessive thought. And so we're able to worm our way with recovery back into those deep recesses of our brains to help what we can talk about right now as a neural pathway for addiction to begin to hibernate and to start to establish some new neural pathways for recovery deep inside of the brain. Ultimately, this begins for us with action and thought. Move a muscle to change a thought. I want y'all to remember that. I said that in the previous video. We got to move a muscle to change a thought. So this requires action, not just thinking. And that kind of belies a very real discussion around the difference between knowledge and wisdom. I can know things about recovery. I can understand things about recovery. I can maybe quote chapter and verse out of the big book or the basic text or whatever. But or even out of Dharma recovery literature, anything like that, I can quote chapter and verse. But unless I'm actually putting the action in to living out that knowledge, I don't have the wisdom of the act. And I often liken this to individuals that have read schematics about car engines, let's say a 327 Corvette engine. For you car heads, don't quote me on that. But, maybe you know how to, have read the schematics, you understand how to take the header off, you know how to remove the cams. Maybe you know how to bore the cylinders out to increase your compression ratio, all that stuff, right? You know about, but you've never put a wrench to an actual engine. You don't have the wisdom of the act. You don't know what it takes to actually tear that engine apart and to rebuild it. So recovery works a lot the same way. It starts with understanding, with acquiring that knowledge, and then learning how to put that knowledge into action so that we begin to acquire wisdom. We begin to acquire the wisdom of the act. And so Liang's statement that it begins with a thought in some ways is right. And we're going to talk about how to move out of that hellish movement by working with those thoughts. So Liang states, and I'm going to quote here, quote, "The devil king, the great Satan, does not want us to know this, but hell has a very humble origin. It begins with a seemingly innocuous thought. Quote, I want to have the same pleasure tomorrow, end quote. Out of this little thought, he says, all hell breaks loose. Fear begins to arise in our attempt to secure our pleasure. We try to take possession of our objects of desire, and we try to our damnedest to eliminate those who are jeopardizing our chance of getting that pleasure tomorrow. Thus, a whole cycle of fear, hatred, and violence begins, and this is the origin of things like slander, backstabbing, ego gratification, office politics, robbery, and murder. Seems kind of extreme, but if we think about it and carry those things out to their logical conclusion as a reaction of fear, it begins to make sense. What Liang is really speaking about here is not just pleasure, though, because pain takes the same seat. In a moment of pain or in the enjoyment of pleasure, our minds begin to slip in to a future orientation that either I want to escape the pain that I'm in right now, tomorrow, or in the future, or I want to experience that same pleasure tomorrow. The anticipation of this really roots not just in the attachment to wanting to escape pain, but our attachment to pleasure, and not recognizing that both of those things are temporary features of our reality, of our life. And so what our minds do is we begin to project into a future that we have no idea what that's going to look like. We have no idea what that future is going to hold. There's no life in that future. What I mean by that is, I mean to say something very specific. Where is it that you draw breath? You don't draw breath in the past, and you don't draw breath in the future. The only place that we are able to live is in this ever-present reality. Remember, based off of our discussions from the prior video, that hell is in the here and now, and so is a paradisiacal moment. They're complements of the same thing. It's a matter of our orientation of our minds and our values toward that moment, to either look at it as a burden or as an opportunity for growth. And so it also calls us to spend time with it. It's very difficult to do that with emotional or psychological pain. When we hurt our bodies, the pain that the body generates is calling our attention to what is injured so that we can take care of it, so that we don't injure ourselves further. we as people who function in an addiction mindset get caught up in trying to end that emotional or psychological pain rather than occupying space with it, rather than experiencing it somatically and finding out what it's trying to teach us. We try to run from it. And with pleasure, we try to extend that into the future over and over and over again. So our relationship with pleasure and pain is what has to change. And that is what Liang is driving at here by talking about it being a result of the way that we think about it and our quote unquote future tripping. We are tripping into the future rather than planning a walk. And I don't mean it as a trip in a psychedelic sense, because that's there too. We begin to fantasize, daydream, catastrophize. But at the same time, when we do that, we are literally tripping over our own feet into a future that hasn't even arrived yet. So remember, the only place that we can live is in the here and now. And I'll do a little experiment with you. The only way you're going to be able to do this is to rewind the video. But I'm snapping my fingers in the here and now, right? Those fingers are being snapped and it's done. That moment is past. Where do those snaps live? They're recorded here on the internet, on YouTube, and you can rewind the video to see me snap my fingers again. But where the actual snapping of those fingers occurred, here in this shed, right? You can't go back and stop me from snapping my fingers any more than you can stop me breathing in the present moment. And the only relationship that we have, and we'll come back to this concept later, is in memory. Memory provides us with a continuity of identification of experience and the self. And then based off of our experience in the future, we develop these predictions based off of what we've developed in our life. So if we have a life that is rife with chaos, we've come out of a chaotic life, we're used to a chaotic life. When we occupy a moment in the present, we start to project that chaos into the future. In fact, we begin to expect it. We expect it. And so that creates a hellish moment, because I can't retreat to my past necessarily for peace or for learning, because oftentimes for people that deal with addiction, a walk through our heads, a walk through our memories is like a walk through a haunted house. And we can't occupy space in a hopeful future because the choices we make are chaotic. They're reactive to the chaos in the moment. And so both places become pregnant with fear. And that creates this hellish moment in the present. Leon goes on to talk about it. And he says, thus, hell is a result of not living in the moment. Again, he brings up the theologian C.S. Lewis. And he offered this fictional conversation in his book, Between Two Devils, in his book, The Screwtape Letters. And in that book, I will provide a link below for both of these in the comments section. I'll pin Liang's book, and in a reply, I will have access to C.S. Lewis's book, The Screwtape Letters, there. But Lewis says, our business is to get them, humans, away from the eternal and from the present. Remember the eternal moment that we discussed in the past, versus the perpetual being trapped in a moment. In the past video, they go on to say, these devils in C.S. Lewis's book, The Screwtape Letters, it is better to make them live in the future. Biological necessity makes all their passions point in that direction already, so that thought about the future inflames hope and fear. Also, it is unknown to them, so that in making them think about it, we make them think of unrealities. In a word, the future is, of all things, the least like eternity. Hence, Nearly all vices are rooted in the future. Gratitude looks to the past, and love to the present moment. Fear, avarice, and lust and ambition look ahead. Those are all really key descriptions that Lewis remarks on. First of all, I want to remark on the biological drive to be forecasting into the future. This is something that we were geared to. It's what kept us alive as a species, is being able to predict things like outcomes, consequences, being able to judge those things on a far off horizon. The problem for people that deal with addiction, and this doesn't go away just because we enter into recovery, because we put the drugs and alcohol down, whatever our addiction is, whatever our fixation is, it does not stop just because we stop that behavior. We have to work at the way that we've trained our mind to think. But for those of us that are still, locked up in problematic using and problematic relationships to drugs and alcohol, we cannot look at our past, as I mentioned earlier, because of the chaotic nature and some of the trauma and damage that's occurred there. We don't want to dwell there. And the future is pregnant with fear. And the question is, why? Why? This is related to the Buddhist concept of cause and effect. The author and Zen Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh, who recently passed, described in his book Zen Keys the relationship of what he calls causality and how Western thinking has missed the mark with that. In common descriptions in Western philosophy, we describe a cause and an effect. There's a direct line between the cause of something and the effect. So I have a baseball in my hand. I throw that baseball toward my house, and that baseball goes through the window. The cause is me having the baseball in my hand and throwing it at the house, and then the baseball entering in to the window and breaking it. And there seems to be only the cause could only have this one effect. In Buddhist thinking, it's really an understanding that with a cause, there comes a whole set of possible outcomes, of possible effects. And then there are probable effects of what is likely to occur. And so as a result, we are given over to recognizing that, sorry, my dog is barking, but given over to recognizing that we have a set of possibilities and probabilities that can occur based off of this one cause. If I throw the baseball, I may misthrow it, and it may miss the window entirely. I may drop it. It may hit the window, and the window may not break because of the way that the ball hits the window. There's all sorts of things that can occur. But for us in addiction, when we have developed this chaotic way of life, we've surrounded ourselves in chaos, and we have geared toward chaotic thinking, we see nothing but catastrophe that lives in the future. There's nothing possible but catastrophe in our minds. And so we forecast into that, and this creates this very hellish moment. When we relate to ourselves that way, and we begin to think that way, the problem is that our worldview becomes so confined to a large degree, our perspective becomes so confined that we can only see the importance of our own life and our own pain to the exclusion of other things. The other thing is that our judgment about consequences, our judgment about goals shortens away from this distant horizon into my understanding of how I need to get my drug of choice and how I need to use my drug of choice, because it will eliminate the pain of my past and it will obfuscate the fear of my future. and I have that bliss or that oblivion on top. I can escape both temporal realities. I can escape both of them with that. And that is where we get caught up in the cycle, because when I get come out of that and my bank account's dry, the lights are shut off, I have no gas and no water anymore, and I'm looking around for a way to score. What really has come to the fore here is that the things I said I would never do when I first started using have become, I haven't done that yet. And those not yets have become a lived nightmare, meaning that all the things I said I would never do, I am now doing. So Liang moves forward in his discussion here. And he says that we fix our attention on the future. If we fix our attention on the future, our anxiety will be endless. And that Jesus portrays hell as a place, quote, where their worm does not die and the fire is not quenched. This comes from Mark chapter 9, verse 48. His metaphors, Liang says, seem to come directly from the prophet Isaiah, where that comes from chapter 66, verse 24. And Isaiah says, and they shall go forth and look on the dead bodies of the men that have rebelled against me, God, for their worm shall not die, their fire shall not be quenched, and they shall be an abhorrence to all living beings. The symbolic nature, Liang points out, is obvious from the Old Testament. And he goes on to say in his discussion that the fire and the worm aren't external instruments of torture that are put upon people to be found in hell. This fire and this worm dwell inside of us. And for the purposes of our discussion, the fire becomes the obsession and the worm is the compulsion that eats at us from the inside. The desire to use and the compulsion to use, the obsession for that use and the compulsion to use are the fire and the worm in this. The Isaiah uses the term their fire and their worm, attributing a possession of those things to convey that the source of their suffering is internal. And the fire in hell, unlike other kinds of fire, can't be quenched because it burns from within in the present moment. We have to get deep inside of ourselves to the source of that fire. Otherwise, we have no way to put it out. So the worm here does not die because it gets its nutrients from inside of our fear and those negative emotions, the unresolved trauma. And the dead mentioned in this passage are the spiritually dead, those who have shut down spiritually, who are constantly tormented by their own lust and greed, anger, jealousy, these resentments, and they don't have any peace, which comes up from our discussion of the relationship that we have to our pasts. They're a tragedy to those who are spiritually alive. For the former, Liang says, live like zombies, tortured by inner suffering, and yet totally unaware of the kingdom that lives within them. And this is coming from another quote that Jesus talks about, another Zen puzzle, or what is called a koan, that the kingdom of God is within us. The kingdom of God is at hand, right? You just have to reach out and grab it. And so inside of us dwells this unquenchable fire and this worm. It is the fire of obsession and the gnawing worm of that compulsion to use. And so as a result, what we have to resolve goes back to this idea that hell is in the here and now. Hell is not perpetual. Doesn't have to be. We can walk out of that. And the third key in this statement is that it is a result of our thinking. And so we have to begin to start to change our thinking so that we can move a muscle to change the thought. Again, I have to do something different, whatever that may be. Small changes Little changes. Maybe today, if you're still actively using, use a little bit less. Try not to use as frequently throughout the day. Try to stretch it out. If you're in recovery, it's about the way that we relate to our past and our future. It really boils down to assuming responsibility for owning our moment. That even though this moment may be pregnant with pain or an evaporating pleasure, that this moment still belongs to us. And that I can change that haunted house that is my past into a museum that I can learn from. And if I'm making recovery oriented choices in the here and now, I'm sowing the seeds of hope in my future. That it's not a guarantee of order, but that there is a likelihood of an organized outcome for my future. I'm no longer living in chaos. I'm no longer forecasting chaos. I'm no longer living in the catastrophe, in a slow motion train wreck. I'm actually living in something where I have the ability to survive. Now, final comment here. Why am I broadcasting from a shed? Why are we having shed talks even? Because sometimes our recovery begins in spaces just like this. I may have ended up here at the end of my addiction. I may have ended up at some place where I had a moment of clarity and thought to myself, you know what? I got to do something different. I'm not going to live, like, just think something different. I'm going to live something different. And so, what I want to end with is a challenge for you is to translate that knowledge into wisdom, to start to move that and to try to enter into that flow state where we're no longer living in a perpetual hell, trapped in time, but we're living in an ever present reality that gives us the gift of freedom. So, with that, stay grounded, recover. Shed Talks Recovery, and I'm Chris Bailey. Thank you for joining me today.